在诗篇第96篇这样说：你们要向耶和华唱新歌，全地都要向耶和华歌唱，要向耶和华歌唱，称颂他的名，天天传扬他的救恩，在列邦中述说他的荣耀，在万民中述说他的奇事。因耶和华为大，当受极大的赞美，他在万神之上，当受敬畏。各位弟兄姐妹以及慕道朋友们平安。让我们大家一起起立，把荣耀颂赞归给至高无上的真神，坐在宝座上圣洁羔羊。坐在宝座上圣洁羔羊，我们夫妇敬拜你，其在今在以后永在，唯有你是全能真神。坐在宝座上尊贵羔羊，我们夫妇敬拜你，颂赞尊贵荣耀全是都归给你，直到永远。万万之王，万主之主，唯有你名的得主将尊崇。万万之王，万主之主，我们高举你生命直到永远。坐在宝座上圣洁羔羊，我们夫妇敬拜你，其在今在以后永在，唯有你是全能真神。坐在宝座上尊贵羔羊，我们夫妇敬拜你，颂赞尊贵荣耀全是都归给你，直到永远。万万之王，万主之主，唯有你配得敬拜和尊崇。万万之王，万主之主，我们高举你生命直到永远。万万之王，万主之主，唯有你配得敬拜和尊崇。万之王，万主之主，我们高举你生命直到永远。我们高举你生命直到永远。在约书亚记第1章，耶和华的仆人摩西死了以后，耶和华晓谕摩西的帮手嫩的儿子约书亚说：我的仆人摩西死了，现在你要起来，和众百姓过这约旦河，往我所要赐给以色列人的地去。凡你们脚掌所踏之地，我都照着我所应许摩西的话赐给你们了。只要刚强，大大壮胆，谨守遵行我仆人摩西所吩咐的一切律法，不可偏离左右，使你无论往哪里去都可以顺利。我岂没有吩咐你吗？你当刚强壮胆，不要惧怕，也不要惊慌，因为你无论往哪里去，耶和华你的神必与你同在。那我们大家一起唱，靠主刚强。 到你，你当刚强，当土主刚强，充满喜乐，你的神有余，充满喜乐，你的神有余。在腓立比书第3章7到8节这样说：只是我先前以为与我有益的，我现在因基督都当作有损的；不但如此，我也将万事当作有损的，因我以认识我主基督耶稣为至宝。我为他已经丢弃万事，当作粪土，我要得着基督。让我们一起唱《认识你》。我以前生命所寻求事情，在此界追逐名利富贵，健康为有损，健康为有损，一切事情都不能相比。认识你，耶稣，认识你是最重要的事。你美善是公义，是喜乐，是我一切，主我深爱你。写我心所愿，追求认识你，愿在你里面能归属你。一心深深已非我做的事，一切恩赐多不能相比。认识你，耶稣，认识你是最重要的事。你美善是公义，是喜乐，是我一切，主我深爱你。让我晓得你复活大恩你，你晓得和你一同受苦，让我更像你，效法你的事，我也得以从死里复活。认识你，耶稣，认识你是重要的事。你美善是公义，是喜乐，为我一切，主我深爱你。
我们一起低头祷告。我们亲爱的天父，坐在宝座上圣洁的羔羊，我们的救主主耶稣基督，我们感谢你。在这主日的清晨，我们来到你的殿中，来到你的面前，来敬拜你，来赞美你，来向你呼求。主，我们看到这个世界上的人都入羊走迷，个人都偏行己路。主就在这个时候光照我们，充满我们，让我们真知道主你是爱我们的。主，我们感谢你，你不仅用你的宝血拯救了我们，你也为我们开了一条 既活泼又充满生命的这样的道路，让我们靠着你就不致失望。主，我们感谢你赐平安给我们，因为你所赐的平安不是世界上所能带给我们的，是你在十字架上所成就的。你把平安给了我们，你就是我们的平安。虽然我们经历了许多的风暴，刚刚过去的这个风暴 hurricane 也给我们的备城造成很大的影响。主，我们感谢你保守我们教会，很多的家庭都能顺利的，虽然经过一些难处，来到你的面前，蒙受你的保守。主，我们感谢你，我们也感谢你不仅赐平安给我们，也给我们盼望，让我们无论在什么样的光景之下，我们都不至于失望。就像保罗所说的，我们虽然四面受敌，却不被困住，心里作难，却不致失望。我们感谢你给我们这样美好的应许，我们继续凭着信心来宣告：主，你是我们的救主，你是我们的主，我们所有的好处都不在你以外。主，你要帮助我们，谁能抵挡我们呢？主，就求你继续按照你的应许来祝福我们，也帮助那些在困难当中来仰望你的。主，就求你使你的大能的手来拯救，无论是在病痛当中，还是在工作中需要的，还是在其他方面需要的，主你都知道。主，你是愿意以笑脸来帮助我们的。主，就求你按照他们的需要，按照你的心意来成就。主，我们特别为教会的需要献上仰望。主，我们今天有一位英文的应聘的牧者来到我们中间来英文堂来证道。主，就求你真的是给他智慧，给他言语，来印证主是否他是我们教会所需要的英文牧者。我们真的是感谢你。主，我们也特别为刚刚按牧的Pastor Daniel Jackson， 他今天来到我们主堂中文堂来证道。主，就求你高毛他的口，主，让你的信息通过他来释放出来。我们也感谢他们一家在我们备城的这2年的侍奉。主，他们也按照主你的意向，按照你的呼召，即将在下个月到欧洲去宣教。主，就求你保守他们的平安，祝福他们所到之处。主，就求你与他们同在。主，就求你继续的使用他们，他们愿意有这样一颗为你宣教的心。主，就求你保守刚强壮胆，让他们所到之处都能让你的福音传出去。我们真的是感谢你。主，也为我们教会其他方面的需要献上仰望。主，要感谢你，让我们教会在这个疫情当中能够持续的这样的通过网上和实体的敬拜，主，这样的顺利的进行。感谢你。主，也求你保守我们今天的敬拜从开始到末了。主，我们感谢你，奉主耶稣基督的名祷告，阿们。我们一起来读今天的正道经文，哥林多后书4章16到18节。我们一起来读。所以我们不丧胆，外体虽然毁坏，内心却一天新似一天。我们这至暂至轻的苦楚，要为我们成就极重无比永远的荣耀。原来我们不是所顾念所见的，乃是顾念所不见的，因为所见的是暂时的，所不见的是永远的。谢谢神的话语，大家请坐。Please receive seat。接下来是我们奉献祷告的时间。我们亲爱的天父，我们的主耶稣，我们感谢你，感谢你给我们一切的需要，供应我们一切的需要。主，也感谢你给我们每个人有各样的能力，也有时间来侍奉你。主，我们为我们教会弟兄姊妹的奉献向上感恩。主，他们愿意真的是在时间、金钱和侍奉上都与你的国度有份。主，就求你纪念，也求你继续激励我们，让我们看到你国度的需要，也看到世人的需要，真的是 让我们能够成为世界上所有需要人的邻舍，能够甘愿付出我们所有的。我们感谢你，也求你使用我们的奉献。这样的感恩祷告是奉主耶稣基督的名求，阿们。今天呢，是我们非常特殊的这样的一个主日，因为是我们的 Pastor Daniel Jackson 为我们证道。他们一家呢，可能你们也已经知道，已经受到神的呼召，要到欧洲去宣教。第一站大概是在德国。真的是愿神的是保守祝福他们，也就是纪念他们一家有这么奉献的心智。接下来我们就会请Pastor Daniel 呢来给我们证道，另外沈岩姊妹做翻译。Now it's time to welcome Pastor Daniel and Sister Shen Yan. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Brother Qilong.
谢谢启龙。
And it's a pleasure to be with all of you, worshiping with all of you, and to be able to share from Scripture today.
很开心今天可以和你们一起来敬拜，也有机会分享经文。
Today we are thinking about the Apostle Paul, thinking about the Apostle Paul and what he can teach us about the topic of evangelism.
今天我们来和使徒保罗一起来思想这个传福音这个话题。
Specifically, we want to see what the letter of 2 Corinthians can teach us about this topic.
特别的是，我们也想借着哥林多后书来去看看保罗教导我们怎样来去传福音。
We in the English ministry have spent a lot of time thinking deeply about this, the practice of sharing the gospel message.
我们英文事工组已经花了很多时间深入的思考传福音以及如何分享福音信息这件事。
How do we do it? How do we do it well? And if we can speak of this, what are the ethics of evangelism?
我们怎样来去传福音？我们怎样能够更好的传福音呢？
And by looking at the teachings of Paul, we can learn about how we all, not just me as a pastor and not just someone who has the title of an evangelist, can practice evangelism faithfully in the 21st century.
借着学习使徒保罗的教导，我们可以学习如何在这个21世纪忠心的传福音，不只是牧师和传道人，而是我们所有人都要学习的。
I want to begin by looking at an image from an artist named James Janknicht.
我想先和大家一起来看一个图片，它是 James Jacknet 画的。
It depicts the Apostle Paul on the road to Damascus with his vision of Christ.
他描绘的是保罗在去往大马士革路上的经历。
The image presents much for us to think about.
这个图片有很多值得我们思考的。
You can see that the Apostle Paul is actually wearing 21st century garb, a suit and a tie.
大家可以注意到，保罗这里面穿的是21世纪的服装。
And around the central image are events from the Apostle Paul's life, like his teaching under Gamaliel and his stoning of the early Christians.
就是周围的图片描述是保罗生命里的一些事件。
But at the center of the image is Paul's vision of Christ.
但是在这个正中间是保罗遇见基督，这是在这幅图片的中心。
That's intentional. This is the central experience of Paul's life around which everything revolves.
我想这是刻意安排的，因为这是保罗生命中最关键的经历，一切都是围绕着他。
Notice that the Apostle Paul is depicted as upside down.
大家可以注意到，保罗在这个图片里是上下颠倒的。
Paul's life has been completely turned upside down by his vision of Christ.
保罗的生命也从此完全被翻转了。
One of the aspects of the image that I want to focus on today is how Jesus is presented in the image.
今天我想着重的其中一个方面是这幅图片是如何描述基督的形象。
Notice that Christ is holding out his hand, showing the marks of the crucifixion.
注意到基督正伸出他的手，带着钉痕的印记。
Paul's vision is specifically of Christ crucified, which is what has turned his life upside down.
保罗在这里的意象是主耶稣基督被钉十字架这件事情彻底的改变了他的生命。
The image of Christ crucified moved Paul to rethink it all: God, life, ministry, success.
主耶稣基督被钉十字架这件事，使保罗重新去思考所有的是神、生命、成功和事工。
And I want to look at that today by considering Paul's understanding of this notion of the image of God.
今天我想借着考察保罗时代关于神的形象的教导来看主耶稣基督钉十字架。
We who have read the book of Genesis know that it talks about this idea of the image of God.
我们读过创世纪的知道神的形象这个描述在那里有出现过。
But actually, this idea, image of God, was not a distinctly scriptural one.
不过实际上神的形象这个概念并不是单属圣经的。
Ancient philosophers around the time of Paul thought about this idea of the image of God, and I want to look at two examples of that today.
在保罗时代的哲学家们就已经思考了神的形象这个概念。今天我想来看两个例子。
This is what one ancient philosopher named Plutarch said about the image of God.
这是其中一个哲学家叫做普鲁塔克，他讲到的一个人关于神的形象的概念。
The ruler is the image of God, who orders all things. Such a ruler needs no Phidias, nor Polykleitus, nor Myron, these are famous sculptors in the ancient world, to model him. For by his virtue he forms himself in the likeness of God, and thus creates a statue most delightful of all to behold, and most worthy of divinity.
他说，统治者是有序管理万物的神的形象。这样的一位统治者不需要腓迪亚斯、波里克莱图斯或米农，这些都是很著名的雕刻家来塑造他。他通过自身的美德，为自己塑造了一座与神相像的雕像，令人欣喜，充满神性。
Plutarch says that a person, by their way of life, by the way that they act in the world, day to day, by their virtue, they may form themselves into the likeness or image of God for others to see.
普鲁塔克说，一个人借着他的生活方式，他每天的行为，他的美德，可能会让他有神的形象，从而被别人仰慕。
Plutarch is drawing from another ancient philosopher, Plato, who says that you can be sure that whoever sincerely wishes to become just and by practicing virtue make himself like a god will never be overlooked by the gods.
他的普鲁塔克的这种描述是借鉴了另外一个哲学家，也就是柏拉图的教导。柏拉图说，一个人通过变得公正和操练美德，能够变得更像神。这样做，你就让自己和神相似，然后你也永远不会被神所轻视。
Paul was familiar with this philosophical thinking about the image of God by your way of life forming an image of God in the world.
保罗对于这种通过自己的生活方式来让自己更像神的形象的这种概念是非常熟悉的。
But we have to think with Paul about what it means when you define the image of God like this.
但是我们需要跟保罗一起来思考，当你定义神的形象是如这幅图片里面一样时，会怎样？
When one defines God in terms of Christ, and specifically Christ crucified.
当一个人用基督来定义神，特别是他被钉在十字架上来定义神的时候，
As Paul says in 2 Corinthians, Christ is the image of God.
就如保罗在哥林多后书所说的，主耶稣基督是神的形象。
So I want to look at 2 Corinthians, and we will see there the extent to which the vision of Christ revolutionized Paul's life and ministry.
我们今天会一起来看哥林多后书里，保罗是怎样仔细讲述了基督的显现，以及怎样彻底改变他的思想。
I hope that many of you have had the opportunity to read and reflect on 2 Corinthians.
我希望，我们当中的大部分人都已经读过，也思考过哥林多后书。
And if you have, you might have been like me when I first read the letter 2 Corinthians and said, "What is going on here?"
如果你读过，你可能会和我很久以前第一次读这本书时的有类似的经历。你可能会问，到底发生了什么？这里
There's a lot about Moses. There's a lot about Paul's own challenges in ministry. Apparently, the Corinthians are once again upset about Paul about something.
这里讲了很多关于摩西还有保罗自己在事工中遇到的挑战。很明显，哥林多人再一次因着什么事情对保罗很懊恼、很生气、很失望。
Paul in 2 Corinthians is dealing with a criticism within the Corinthian community having to do with issues of bodily strength, rhetorical excellence, Moses' glory, and the related issue of Paul's fitness as an apostle.
在哥林多后书里，保罗是正在处理当时哥林多人对他的哥林多人的一个批判，是关于身体形象、修辞的卓越、摩西的荣耀，以及与此相关的保罗是否适合做使徒。
There was a convention in the ancient world about how divine emissaries, speakers sent on behalf of God, should be in the world.
古代社会对于神的使者、神的发言人应该是什么样子，有一些标准。
They were supposed to be beautiful, handsome. They were supposed to be physically impressive, even godlike.
他们应该是美丽英俊的，他们应该是在形象上是出众的，甚至像神一样。
One author talks about it like this. He was tall and handsome in appearance and really godlike. His skin was fair, his beard not very thick. His eyes shone with a great glow of fervor and enthusiasm. His voice was at once very sweet and very clear, and in a word, no fault could be found in him in any respect as far as all that went. Such then was his outward appearance. That was the ideal speaker.
一个作者在描写一个演说家应该有的样子时，他是这么说的：他很魁梧、堂皇，真像天神似的。他的皮肤白嫩，胡子不太浓，他的眼睛闪烁着十分炽烈而又热情的光芒，他的声音非常清朗悦耳。一句话，在这些方面没有什么可以挑剔的。就外表而论，他就是这样一个人。
This is the one who represents God. He's godlike. In the ancient world, a person's outward appearance was held to reflect the character of their soul.
这才是一个代表神的人，他像神一样。在过去，一个人的外貌会被认为能够反映他的品格。
We don't have this idea in Western culture as much. If you're an attractive person, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are a good person.
而现在在西方社会，我们并不会相信这个概念。当你的外表出众，并不表示你就一定是个好人。
But there was this belief in the ancient world, and it's something that we need to understand if we want to understand 2 Corinthians.
但是这是古代社会所持守的理念，而我们也需要注意这个，特别是在读哥林多后书的时候。
This way of thinking had influenced how people interpreted the book of Exodus and the story of Moses.
这个理念甚至影响了古代人他们如何诠释出埃及记以及摩西的故事。
This is what one ancient writer, Philo, said about Moses.
这是一个古代的philosophy。
His name is Philo.
OK，Philo 说到关于摩西的时候，他是这么说的。
As for eating and drinking, he had no thought of them for 40 successive days, because he had the better food of contemplation, through whose inspiration sent from heaven above, he grew in grace, first of mind, then of body through the soul, and in each singly so advanced in strength and well-being, that those who saw him afterwards could not believe their eyes.
至于吃的和喝的，也就是摩西，连续40天都没有想到他们，无疑是因为他拥有更好的沉思之时，靠着这从天上降下的食粮的振奋，他获得越来越多的荣光，先是心灵上，再是通过灵魂在身体上，在这两方面都变得如此强大和健壮，那些后来看见他的人简直不能相信自己的眼睛。
Philo said, After the 40 days had passed, he descended with a countenance far more beautiful when he ascended, so that those who saw him were filled with amazement and awe, nor even could their eyes continue to stand the dazzling brightness that dashed from him like the rays of the sun.
法尔勒继续说，在所说的40天之后，他下山，脸上带着比上山前俊美的多的面容，所以那些看见他的人充满了敬畏和惊讶，甚至他们的眼睛也不能持续盯着他身上发出的令人炫目的明亮，就像太阳的光芒似的。
Moses had been transformed both body and soul, and Moses was the supreme example of one sent from God, God's man.
摩西的灵魂和身体都已经被改变了。摩西是神所差的，是神人的最优秀的榜样。
Hulk Hogan Moses, the Rock Moses.
Sorry,
Hulk Hogan, famous wrestler.
OK. Hulk Hogan, 就是摩西很健壮，很强壮。
He was so physically impressive that people could literally not look at his face.
他的外貌如此出众，以至于人们不能直接看他的脸。
Meanwhile, who is this person, Paul?
然而，这个保罗是谁呀
？The Corinthian criticism is encapsulated in 2 Corinthians 10:10. His letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak, and his speech contemptible.
哥林多人的批判从哥林多后书10章10节就看得出来，他是其貌不扬，他的信又沉重又厉害，及至见面却是气貌不扬，言语粗俗的。
This person, he can't be from God. He is weak, and he can barely string 2 sentences together.
这个人他不可能是从神来的，他如此软弱，甚至不能将2句话说出来。
He may even be a trickster and a crook.
他甚至可能是个骗子。
So the Corinthians are criticizing Paul and questioning his apostleship and appealing to Moses in relation to that.
所以哥林多人驳斥保罗，也质疑他的使徒身份，他们更被摩西所吸引。
Paul's response is in 2 parts.
保罗的回答有2方面。
First, he calls the Corinthians to understand that Moses' glory was temporary, not permanent, and it's an inferior glory to the glory that Paul offers.
首先，保罗呼吁哥林多人要了解摩西的荣光是短暂的，不是永久的，因此这个荣光不如保罗的事工所提供的荣光更伟大。
He says, "Now if the ministry of death chiseled in letters of stone tablets came in glory, so that the people of Israel could not gaze at Moses' face because of the glory of his face, a glory now set aside, how much more will the ministry of the Spirit come in glory? If what was set aside came through glory, much more has the permanent come in glory."
保罗说，那用字刻在石头上属死的执事尚且有荣光，甚至以色列人因摩西面上的荣光不能定睛看他的脸，这荣光原是渐渐退去的，何况那属灵的执事岂不更有荣光吗？
Paul is saying that his ministry does come with glory, not for him only, but for everyone, and that this glory is permanent.
保罗在这里说，他的事工是有荣光的，不只是保罗自己有荣光，是所有人都有荣光，而且这个荣光是永久的。
That's part 1 of his response.
这是他的回应的第一部分。
Part 2 of his response is to redefine the suffering and weakness that the Corinthians see.
保罗回应的第2部分是重新定义受苦和软弱。
Notice what Paul does not do.
注意保罗在这里面没有做什么。
He does not say, "Actually, I'm very strong. Let's get into an arm wrestling match and I'll show you."
保罗没有说，其实我真的很强壮，不信我们可以来场扳手腕比赛，我可以向你们展示一下。
Paul says that his suffering and weakness are actually manifesting the gospel message to the Corinthians.
保罗说，因着他所受的苦和软弱，实际上却是向哥林多人显明了福音。
Paul says that by his suffering love and weakness on behalf of the Corinthians, he is forming an image of Christ.
保罗说，他为了这哥林多人所受的苦和软弱，他正在效法主耶稣基督的样式。
chapter 4, verses 8 and 11. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may be made visible in our bodies. For while we live, we are always being given up to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may be made visible in our mortal flesh.
我们来看哥林多后书4章8到11节，我们四面受敌却不被困住，心里作难却不致失望，遭逼迫却不被丢弃，打倒了却不致死亡，身上常带着耶稣的死，使耶稣的生也显明在我们身上。因为我们这活着的人是常为耶稣被交于死地，使耶稣的生在我们这必死的身上显明出来。
Paul says, we have commended ourselves in every way.
保罗说，我们在各样的事上表明自己是神的用人。
Notice that he does not say, I am the most impressive speaker, I have attracted the greatest audience.
注意到他没有说我是最优秀的演讲者，或者我曾经吸引过一大群听众来听我讲论。
We have commended ourselves through great endurance in afflictions, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, riots, labors, sleepless nights, hunger. We are treated as impostors and yet are true, as unknown and yet as well known, as sorrowful yet are always rejoicing, as poor yet making many rich.
保罗是这么评价自己的：就如在许多的忍耐、患难、穷乏、困苦、鞭打、监禁、扰乱、勤劳、警醒、不时，似乎是诱惑人的，却是诚实的；似乎不为人所知，却是人所共知的；似乎忧愁，却是常常快乐的；似乎贫穷，却是叫许多人富足的。
Notice the language of being poor yet making many rich. That language is applied explicitly to Christ later in 2 Corinthians.
注意到这里所提到的似乎贫穷，却是叫许多人富足，在哥林多书后面也明显的用在主耶稣基督身上。
Paul is saying that I am by my suffering on your behalf modeling Christ to you.
保罗在这里是说，借着为你们受苦，我在向你们展示基督的样式。
Paul says, if you want to learn what the gospel is about, if you want to learn what Christ is about, then you can see it in my suffering presence on your behalf.
保罗在这里说，如果你想知道福音是关于什么，基督是关于什么，那你们可以在我们为你们所受的苦中看到这些。
I have interacted with many non-believers over the years who say, I don't believe in God.
我在这些年间接触过很多不信主的人，他们会说我不相信上帝。
And I, of course, want them to believe in God.
我当然很希望他们能相信上帝。
But I will often respond by saying something like, what kind of God do you not believe in? It's very possible that I don't believe in that God either.
但是我常常会这样回应他们：你不相信的是什么样子的神呢？很有可能我也不相信那样子的神。
John 1:18 says, no one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who has made him known.
约翰福音1章18节说：从来没有人看见神，只有在父怀里的独生子将他表明出来。
So Paul is saying that he preaches the gospel not only with word of mouth, but also by way of his bodily presence in the world.
保罗在说，他传讲福音不是只是通过言语，也是身体力行。
And Paul shows us in 2 Corinthians, as one author, Brian Stone, has written, that weakness, vulnerability, incarnation, and refusability are all markers of faithful Christian witness.
正如 Brian Stone 写的，保罗在哥林多后书向我们显明，软弱、受伤、道成肉身、被拒绝，都是忠实基督徒见证的记号。
Paul makes clear, moreover, that it is not just for him as an apostle or some select group that this applies.
保罗也说得很清楚，这些不是只是他作为使徒或者是一部分人才会有的。
Salvation is the transformation of all of us into the image of God's Son.
救恩是让我们所有人都变成神的模样。
For those whom he knew, he predestined to be conformed into the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers.
罗马书8章29节说：“因为他预先知道的人，就预先定下效法他儿子的模样，使他儿子在许多弟兄中做长子。”
You know, people in society have an idea about how the trajectory of our lives should be.
你们知道社会上人们对我们的生命轨道应该是什么样子有一个理念。
It should be a progressive climb upward, up the ladder of social status, up the ladder of success.
它应该是一个不断往上攀登的，无论是在社会地位上还是在成功上。
Paul teaches us that Christ's life, the life of God, took the precisely opposite trajectory.
保罗教导我们，基督的生命，也就是神的生命，却是取了完全相反的轨道。
He was in the form of God, but came down, taking the form of a slave, of a man, and then went even lower by suffering death, even death on a cross, the most shameful death, the most extreme form of shame.
他本有神的形象，却来到地上，取了人的样式，奴仆的样式，并且自己卑微，以至于死，且死在十字架上，是最糟糕、最极端的羞辱。
Paul gives us an example of and teaches us to form an image of Christ in the world, both individually and corporately, to present Christ to a watching world, both in word and deed.
保罗在这里面向我们展示，我们要传扬福音，不只是个人，也是要与大家一起。然后我们也不是只靠着言语，也要靠着行为。
But I cannot leave it at crucifixion because Paul does not leave it there.
我不能够将我的今天的信息停留在钉十字架上，因为保罗并没有这么做。
The hope of those that follow Christ is that following death there is great glory.
跟随基督的人的盼望是在于死后有荣耀。
After our life of faithfulness, of making visible the life of Christ in our mortal bodies, we experience, like Christ, the resurrection that follows crucifixion.
借着当我们走完信心的旅程，将基督的生命在我们必死的身体上显明，借着服侍神、服侍人，就像基督一样，我们不仅会经历死，也会经历复活。
Paul says, "For this slight momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all measure, because we look not at what can be seen, but what cannot be seen. For what can be seen is temporary, but what cannot be seen is eternal."
保罗在哥林多后书4章最后写道：“我们这至暂至轻的苦楚，要为我们成就极重无比、永远的荣耀。原来我们不是顾念所见的，乃是顾念所不见的。因为所见的是暂时的，所不见的是永远的。”
Like Christ, we look for the glory of resurrection that follows the pouring out of our lives for God's glory and the good of others.
当我们为着神的荣耀和别人的好处而摆上我们的生命，我们所盼望的就是那随之而来的复活的荣耀，正如基督所盼望的。
Would you commit with me as individuals and as a community to form an image of Christ, the crucified one, in the world, and so proclaim the gospel?
你们愿不愿意和我一同委身，作为个人，也是作为团体，来效法那钉在十字架上基督的样式，而因此传扬福音呢？
We have to discern by the leading of the Spirit what that means for us, both individually and corporately, as a body here at CCCBR.
我们必须要省察，如何作为个人和作为团体一起，我们作为贝城华人教会团体一起来传扬福音。谢谢大家。
谢谢 Pastor Daniel 的正道。那我们来一起起立，来一起唱这一首歌《愿主向我吹气》。 我心清洁，使我只愿与主合一，心温顺服主旨。愿主向我吹气，使我完全成圣，使我身心不住圣洁，抓住主的光荣。愿主向我吹气，使我永远生命，使我永远与主同在，永远与主同行。请坐。
好，谢谢Daniel 牧师的信息。Thank you, Pastor Daniel, for the message. 我们今天是有我们的英文牧师的候选人弟兄今天到我们经文堂来证道。那请大家能够就参加英文堂的崇拜，或者说是在网上的 YouTube 里面去来听他的证道，更多的来了解对他有更多的了解。这个是给大家提供，就是如果你还没有到过网上去看的话，你可以就是到我们教会的主页，然后就点击那个英文堂的那个 YouTube 频道的链接，你在这里面可以听到英文堂的这个直播，现场的直播。好，我们的主日学呢有下一个阶段的，就是从9月19号下一个主日开始呢，我们就有第二阶段的主日学的内容。那是有从9月19号到11月28号，就有这3个月，我们就会在学习继续在系统神学的一些基本的一些知识来学习。那就有我们可以看到这个题目，我们有认识神有认识神的作为。那是也感谢招员传道和胡红师母他们的带领。那我们在下一个主日呢，我们就还会继续主日学。好，我们这里面就是下一周的服事呢，有宝柱长老郑美姊妹、胡红师母、建雄弟兄、冬梅姊妹和慧彤姊妹。教会的亲戚呢是少美弟兄一家。好，我们有一些照片呢，是我们在28号的时候安牧典礼的照片。那这些照片呢，我们会放到教会的网页上去。大家以后就是我们会放到，大家可以到网页去看这个照片。这里是一些当时这个安牧典礼的一些照片。好，谢谢大家到报告。
好，谢谢小兵弟兄报告在这里我也补充一个事项我收到了那个林弟兄家人寄来的卡片，也是非常感谢教会中弟兄姐妹在这段时间对他们的关心问候，还有对为他们的代祷也希望大家继续在祷告中来纪念他们。Thank you, Daniel, for your message today. 谢谢 Daniel 今天跟我们分享的信息。那么在这里我也是愿意来欢迎第一次来到我们中间的朋友。好像现场 欢迎秀杰阿姨回到我们中间。然后我相信可能在网上也有一些第一次来到我们中间参加我们聚会的朋友或者弟兄姐妹，我们也很愿意来欢迎你。如果你是第一次来到我们中间，也欢迎你跟教会的相关的同工来联络，在我们教会网站上可以找到相关的信息。好，那么下面呢，大家一起起立，我们领受神的祝福。Let's raise and we receive the benediction. 愿主耶稣基督的恩惠、神的慈爱、圣灵的感动和带领常与我们众人同在，从今时直到永远。阿们。好，今天聚会就到这里，大家请坐，我们默祷后散会。